Well, welcome everyone to our presentation on changes to voting rights through the ages, presented by our good friend Julie Rodewald from the League of Women Voters. Many of you probably know Julie as she served previously as the county clerk recorder, and she now volunteers with the League of Women Voters as the Voter Services Director. And I am Sharon Coronado. I'm the coordinating librarian for adult services, and I hope you'll visit the downtown San Luis Library for a Library of Congress curated exhibit on the 19th Amendment that features historic photos and artifacts, details the story of the battle for ratification, highlights key movements in the suffrage movement, identifies issues of gender equality that remain today, and celebrates Black, Indigenous, Latina, and Asian American suffragists. The exhibit will be on display downtown until September 18th. And the exhibit is presented by the County of SLO Public Libraries, the SLO County Bar Association, the League of Women Voters of SLO County, SLO College of Law, Women Lawyers Association of SLO County, and 2 private donors, and we thank them all very much for their partnership. So you can put your questions into the chat throughout the presentation, and Julie will answer them at the end. And now I will happily turn it over to Julie.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you and the library for inviting the League in to give these presentations. Last week was a presentation on the passage of the 19th Amendment, and today my presentation is on changes to voting rights through the ages or history. And I also want to give a shout out to Ed Cabrera, who's one of our League of Women Voters members, and the PowerPoint that you're going to see, much of it came from him. So I appreciate his assistance in putting this presentation together. I'm going to go ahead and stop my video if I can figure out how to do that quickly. And then so all that you will see is the PowerPoint. I'll be giving this presentation. It takes about 25 to 30 minutes, and then that'll leave plenty of time for questions afterwards. So we're going to talk so you think you can vote and go over a brief history of America's voting rights. In the early years, as everyone knows, the colonists brought many of the English political laws and customs with them to this new land that created the original 13 colonies. And in most of those colonies, only adult white males that owned land, and usually at least 50 acres, could vote. Many people believed that landowners were the only ones responsible enough to make political decisions. And one of the things that you might wonder is, well, what percentage of the population was white male landowners? And I've seen anything from 4 to 6% of the population at that time could vote. So it's a very restrictive electorate, if you will, in those early years of our country. So who did it leave out? It left out poor white men, it left out women, American Indians, and Africans, both free and enslaved people. Left all of them out of the voting process. So the framers of the Constitution couldn't agree on who should have the right to vote. So they gave each state the power to decide what its own voting rights would be. And over time, states dropped the requirement that voters must own property. Some states acted faster than others. New York got rid of the property requirement in 1821, but Rhode Island didn't change it until 1880. So you can see already that there's a 60-year gap in who could vote in different states. In New York, you didn't have to own property. In Rhode Island, you did. So let's talk about the African American vote, because that was the first big change. We all know the 13th Amendment was passed, which abolished slavery and indentured servitude, except as punishment for crime. And then along 3 years later came the 14th, and it said that all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States and the state where they reside, and they may not deny, any state may not deny any person equal protection of the laws. And then the 15th Amendment was finally passed 5 years after the end of the Civil War, which states that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So it said that former slaves could not be turned away from the polls due to the color of their skin or the fact that they had been slaves. But I think we all know that we'll see that those rules weren't always followed. So the year's 1915, I'm a single African-American man living in Chicago, Illinois. Can I vote? Yes, you can. But now it's 1948 or even earlier. I'm an African-American living in the deep South. I work in the cotton fields and cannot read or write. Can I vote? Nope, it's not likely that you're going to get to vote. So even after the Civil War, many people in the South did not want African Americans to have the same rights as white Americans. And we certainly know about segregated drinking fountains and schools and facilities, but it also included the right to vote or hold office. And some states and counties passed laws that made voting almost impossible. So they used many different methods to prevent African Americans from voting. They limited opportunities to register to vote. They participated in intimidating those that were either trying to register or vote. Arrests and beatings by police, threats of violence toward the family and home, personal information shared with groups like Ku Klux Klan and employers, and unfair tests at the polls. So here's an example of a poll test that asked voters to correctly guess the number of cotton balls in a jar before they're allowed to vote. Another test would ask voters to guess the number of bubbles in a bar of soap. And then the literacy test was one type of poll test that was given in some locations, and they were tested on their reading skills. Like with other tests, white voters always passed while African American voters usually failed. So these are the requirements in Alabama. You need to read a section of the Constitution out loud. You need to tell what the section says in your own words. You need to write out another section of the Constitution and then answer 8 questions on the Constitution. And I have to challenge all of us to be able to complete all 4 of these, unless you're a constitutional scholar or very well read on the Constitution. I would challenge any of us to pass those. In Louisiana, voters who could not prove a 5th grade education had to complete a 30-question test in 10 minutes. That's less than 20 seconds per question. Again, I challenge any of us to complete that test in that time. And many African Americans in those states lacked a quality education, and the tests were meant to exclude these Blacks from the voting process. So here are some examples of literacy tests. In what year did the Congress gain the right to prohibit the migration of persons to the states? I certainly wouldn't have known the answer to that question without Googling it, which obviously we didn't have back then. That was in Alabama. In Louisiana, this one kind of makes my head spin. Spell backwards, forwards, print the word vote upside down, but in the correct order. And then the bottom one is even more convoluted. Place a cross over the 10th letter in this line, a line under the first space, circle, blah, 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 blah. All, could be very confusing, particularly for people that were not completely literate. And then the grandfather clause states you only had the right to vote if your grandfather also had the right to vote. Well, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, many African Americans' grandfathers were slaves, so they couldn't they didn't have the right to vote because their grandfather didn't. And then it would just perpetuate on down generations because they couldn't vote, their grandchildren couldn't vote. There were also poll taxes that were required for voters to pay for the ability to vote. And here's a poll tax receipt. It's a little bit, well, you can see it's at $1.50 for poll taxes due in 1932. But most Southern African Americans were poor sharecroppers that were heavily in debt to landowners. And $1.50 in 1932 equals probably over $23 today. And you can see by the political cartoon, vote here if you can afford it, that this was, they were estimating 10 million Americans who haven't got the money to pay to turn out and vote. So let's look at some other minorities in America. It's 1925. I'm a Chinese man living in California. Can I vote? Nope, you can't vote. There was an act passed in 1882 called the Chinese Exclusion Act, which barred Chinese immigrants from citizenship. At the time, it was most of the immigrants coming into the United States that were of Asian descent were Chinese. And in 1898, there was a landmark decision, US versus Wong Kim Ark. Wong Kim Ark was a citizen of a person of Chinese descent, but born in America. And one of the tenets of the Chinese Exclusion Act was that if you left the United States and came back in, you had to apply for re-entry. Ark did that, was denied entry, and he sued based on the fact that he was born in America, so should be a US citizen based on the 14th Amendment, which said anyone born here is a US citizen. And the Supreme Court sided with Wong Kim Ark and said that, yes, that is correct. He was born in the United States of Chinese descent, but because of his birth here, the birthright, he was a US citizen. So those that were born here they were allowed to vote, but anybody who had immigrated was not allowed to vote because they were barred from citizenship. As I said before, it was focusing on the Chinese immigrants, but in 1924, that got expanded to restricting immigration from all of East Asia. So Japanese, Korean, all of the other countries in East Asia were also barred from citizenship. And that continued until 1943, which removed the ban on naturalization. But it also set up strict quotas, and those wouldn't be removed until much later. But at least immigrants of Asian descent could now become naturalized citizens. So I'm a Mexican American in 1920. Can I vote? Well, it depends on where you live. In 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo granted Mexicans who remained in the United States US citizenship. So they were US citizens as long as they remained in the United States. But some of the border states and other states enacted laws that disenfranchised the Mexican Americans and Hispanics, including white primaries, which were the parties would deem themselves kind of private clubs and they could decide who could participate. So they said, this is a white only primary. And then those were eventually outlawed, but they also used tactics similar to those restricting African-American votes, poll taxes, literacy tests, those sorts of tactics, their fear and intimidation as well, to keep the Mexican-American voters from the polls. So here we get to women. I'm a white woman living in New York City. It's 1915. Can I vote? Nope, you can't vote. Now, if you were living in California, because California passed a law in 1910, then yes, you could vote, but not in New York. So Wyoming gained voting rights after, women gained voting rights after a long, hard fight. And Wyoming gave women the right to vote in 1869, but it took hard work by many people, including Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, before that was finally approved. And women won the right to vote in August of 1920, 101 years ago now. And the 19th Amendment said the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied on account of sex. So the 19th Amendment just passed. I'm a Black woman living in Georgia. Can I vote? Nope, it's not likely that you'll be able to vote. So I apologize. I kind of through that section. I'll just go back to that. And the reason why is because all of the same restrictions that were applied to Black men now are applied to Black women. So while the suffragettes got the right for women to vote, they didn't fight specifically for the right for Black women to vote. And Black women and women of color were often left out of that, the new ability to vote. So I'm an American Indian living in Montana in the year 1915. Can I vote? Nope, you can't vote either. The American Indians were not considered citizens of the United States until 1924. And before that, they were considered members of their own tribal governments. So President Calvin Coolidge signed the Indian Citizenship Act, which gave them the rights and privileges, including voting. But wait, Western states continued to bar Native Americans. And in 1948, Arizona and New Mexico were the last states to extend full voting rights to Native Americans. And just recently in 2013, I mean, now it's 8 years ago, but North Dakota barred anyone without permanent addresses from voting. And that was upheld by the US Supreme Court in 2018. And that included Native Americans living on reservations because they didn't have what was considered a permanent address. But in 2020, the state came to an agreement with the tribes to recognize that the tribal addresses for the purpose of voting. So I live in Washington, just down the street from the White House. The year is 1955. Can I vote for my neighbor, the president? No, you can't. Residents of the District of Columbia did not get the right to vote in presidential elections until the 23rd Amendment was ratified in 1961. And then we have the civil rights movement. And over time, more and more people demanded civil rights for all Americans. The marches, speeches, sit-ins, freedom rides, activities all added up to what we know now as the civil rights movement. So the 24th Amendment was added to the Constitution in 1964, and it banned the use of poll taxes finally in 1964. You could no longer require someone to pay a poll tax in order to vote. But the law also did other things. Oh, the Voting Rights Act was signed by the president in 1965, and this law protected the right to vote for all citizens. It forced the states to obey the Constitution. There's a unique concept that states have to obey the Constitution of the United States, and it reinforced the 15th Amendment. So I graduated from high school in Maryland, class of 1970. I'm 18 years old and just got drafted to fight in Vietnam. Can I vote? No, you can't. So in the 60s and 70s, thousands of young men were drafted to fight in the Vietnam War, but many were too young to vote for the leaders, the very leaders that were sending them to fight in Vietnam. So the 26th Amendment was passed in 1971, and it says the right of the citizens of the United States who are 18 years of age or older to vote shall not be denied on account of age. And I have to say that I turned 18 the first year that 18-year-olds could vote for president. And it was a very exciting time on college campuses then, because we now had the right to participate in elections. And the motto that was chanted was "Old enough to fight, old enough to vote." Now, this movement actually started in World War II for the same reasons, but it took another 20 plus years for it finally to get to pass. So what are some other expansions of voting rights recently? In 1975, there was an amendment to the Voting Rights Act, which required multilingual ballots. In those jurisdictions that met certain requirements about language literacy and English speaking proficiency. And this is tied into the census, which we just completed in 2020, because that's what comes up with the percentage of the population that might trigger a jurisdiction having to print multilingual ballots, and more than English and Spanish, possibly in other languages as well. And then in 1986, UOCAVA, which is the Uniform Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act, required absentee voting for uniformed and overseas citizens. It expanded the period where they can get a ballot to 60 days. And now currently it allows those voters to either get a ballot by email or use a system where they can access a ballot, even though it still has to be mailed in. In 1984, accessibility for voters with disabilities was extended to polling places. So now all polling places need to be accessible to voters with disabilities, voters in wheelchairs, voters who have difficulty walking. And then the National Voting Rights Act, NVRA, which you might also know as Motor Voter, it expands voter registration opportunities in that it says that any time a voter comes into contact with a government agency, they need to be allowed the right to vote, the right to register to vote. And in California now, that's been expanded, that it's automatic voter registration. When you sign up at DMV for your driver's license or change your registration, you're automatically registered to vote unless you opt out of that. So the Help America Vote Act, which came about in 2002, was a big change. And it was because of the elections in 2000. For the first time in our country's history, it gave federal money for elections. It established the Election Administration Commission. It replaced all lever-based and punch card voting systems. It mandated voting systems that were accessible for voters with disabilities, and there has to be at least one of those in every polling place in the country. And that means voters with visual impairments or hand mobility issues need to be able to vote independently and cast their ballot without anybody else knowing how they're casting their ballot. It required the states to establish statewide voter databases. It required voter ID for first-time federal voters, and it required the use of provisional ballots, or expanded the use of provisional ballots, which basically says no voter should be turned away from the polling place. Any voter who shows up to vote, if you cannot determine their right to vote, you are required to give them a provisional ballot, which gets sealed in an envelope, and it's not opened until the election jurisdiction determines whether or not it can be counted. So what can states control? They can still control voter ID requirements, and 31 states do require some sort of ID. 10 are what are considered strict ID requirements, meaning they must be photo ID and presented at voting, and there's no alternative to that. Many of the states that require some sort of ID give the voter many different identifications that they can produce, and also some of them allow the voter to sign a declaration saying that they're eligible to vote, and that's considered okay. And then voters with felony convictions. Most states, they can vote. Anyone with a felony conviction can vote after the completion of their sentence. Now, that ranges from out of prison to off of parole to off of probation to I've paid all my restitution and fines. So there's a whole gamut in there. And interestingly enough, there are 2 states, and I want to say that they're Maine and Vermont, but I might be wrong about that, that never take away voting rights for felons. They're actually able to vote while they're serving their sentence for a felony conviction. But 7 states remove or bar certain felons from voting forever. In Alabama, they call those crimes of moral turpitude. In Tennessee, it's infamous crimes. And then in 3 of the states, Florida, Kentucky, and Wyoming, they recently relaxed it. It used to be you could never vote, and then they reduced the crimes that forever bar you from voting. And you might remember in California last year, we passed a voter initiative that allowed, as soon as a felon is released from prison, they're eligible to register to vote. They don't have to wait until they're off of parole. And then the other things that they can control voter purges, the placement of polling place, the voter registration requirements, access to vote by mail and who can turn in those vote by mail ballots, and early voting opportunities. So there are still a lot of things that the states can control, even though if you look at it from 1976 to today, the voting rights amendments to the Constitution were the 15th, which you cannot deny based on race, skin color, or previous being a slave previously. The 19th removed gender. The 23rd Amendment allowed DC residents to vote. The 24th abolished the poll tax, and the 26th reduced the age from 18 to 21. And then there have been multiple federal laws that also ensure the right to vote. But state efforts continue. There are debates going on in many states that they want to enhance the voter restriction laws, when people can vote, by, which ballot, how they register to vote. And the debates continue. Are these to deter voter fraud? Will they ensure election security? And then the big question is, do they disenfranchise voters in violation of federal law? And that's the question that in most of these cases will be decided eventually by the courts. While the debate can go on, if it's in violation of federal law or the Constitution, will certainly, those will end up in the courts. So I think that that's the end of my presentation. And I'm going to stop my share and turn on my video, and happy to answer any questions that anybody may have.
Thanks, Julie. That was really interesting. I learned a lot, and I definitely would not have passed a lot of those tests, or maybe even
and you're
been
a
able to pay the
librarian.
poll tax, right? So we do have just one question in the Q&A, and that is, when states passed laws giving women the right to vote before 1920, could they vote in national presidential elections or only state and local elections?
I don't know for sure in every state, but yes, I believe that they could vote in all elections in the state, at least in California. But I can't say that the same is absolutely true for every state. And if there's anybody that's here from the 19th Amendment Committee that wants to chime in on that, I'd love to hear if they have other information.
I think you could unmute yourself if there is anybody here that would like to speak to that.
Yeah, hi. I can add a little bit to this. This is Glenn Silloway with the League of Women Voters. And prior to 1920, there was a patchwork of rights for women to vote, sometimes only at the local level. sometimes for school boards, for instance, uh, Wyoming gave women the full right to vote in 1869. So there was a building, a growth of voting rights over time that varied a lot state by state.
Thanks, Glenn. I knew you were there.
Yeah.
Any other questions for Julie from anybody? You are welcome to unmute yourself if that's easier than putting it in the chat.
I see a question that is testing me greatly about what I could tell about the John Lewis Voting Act passed by the House yesterday would restore. And I'm sorry, I don't know. I don't know specifically. Certainly there's been a lot of debate about voting right, but it's, if I remember correctly, it has to do with restoring sections of the Voting Rights Act that were overturned by the Supreme Court, but I have not read the legislation. I have to be honest with you. I've been working with the county elections office in helping with the recall. So I've been a little bit pressed for all sorts of time and haven't quite kept up with the current events. So, but that's one that I'll definitely go take a look at.
Julie, I have a question, a follow-up on the recall, if you can answer this or not.
Sure.
I've seen a lot of what may be interpreted as misinformation, maybe not deliberate, maybe just people don't know the whole story behind the recall. I'm seeing a lot of people saying, and celebrities who have a lot of influence on social media, saying only answer question 1 and leave question 2 blank. Can you tell us if that's correct or if that's incorrect?
Well, so this is what I would pose to anyone voting in the recall election. The two questions are separate. So your vote on one does not affect the vote on the other. So you can take each one separately. But if, no matter how you feel about the recall, do you want to have a say in who becomes governor of California if the recall succeeds? And if you do want to have a say, then I would encourage you to study all the candidates, all 46 of them, and determine who you think is going to be the best candidate to govern for the next, 16 months or so until this term is up. I think that a lot of it comes from the 2003 election, when the message was vote no on the recall, but yes on Cruz Bustamante. And many believe that it sent mixed messages to voters. No, yes, am I supposed to vote yes on the recall and no on Bustamante? But I mean, I think, as you know, as I want to have a say in who governs our state if the recall is successful. And I think that that's a much better approach to the filling out your ballot than just leaving it blank, because then you're leaving it to those who are going to choose that candidate if the recall is successful.
Thank you for clarifying that.
And I think there's another question about voter ID, that, you know, there are many opinions on the issue. Does voter ID actually prevent voter fraud? You know, the Brennan Center, I think it's called the Brennan Center for Justice. There's probably a lot of sources that you can look to that have done studies on this. One of the things that I found when I was doing a presentation several years ago, and I haven't done research on this later, is that they did a survey of people who lived in states where they had strict or stricter voter ID laws, and then states that had lenient voter ID laws, like California, which does not require voter ID. And they found that it had no that there was no difference in how secure they felt that their elections were. If you lived in a state like California, or if you lived in a state, say like Alabama or Mississippi, that had much stricter voter ID laws. But what they found is that your belief in the security of the election system is whether or not your candidate wins. And oftentimes that, is what I would hear when people would question me about the security of the election system. Well, but my candidate never wins. Well, that doesn't, from an elections official point of view, that's the voters that are determining that. It's not the election system. But I think that there are some nonpartisan resources out there that you can look to that speak to voter ID and what voters' attitudes are about those. Oh, somebody just posted, Brennan. Oh, it was you. Thank you, Sharon. BrennanCenter.org.
I had one other question, Julie. You might not know this, but when you talked earlier and you showed the slide about if your grandfather was able to vote, then you would be eligible to vote. Is that where the term like grandfathered in or grandfather clause, is that where that comes from?
That's a good question. It was certainly called the grandfather clause, and it was, back in the 1800s. So it kind of makes sense that it was you were grandfathered in, became a popular term from that very thing that was actually grandfathering African Americans out of the voting process because their grandfather. But I don't know the origins of it. That would be a good thing to research.
I'll have to look that up.
Yeah. One other thing I wanted to say too about voting in the recall election is a lot of people think that, well, why don't I just write in a candidate? Maybe I want to write in the lieutenant governor, and if she gets the most votes, then she will win. But in order to have a vote count for a write-in candidate, they have to be a certified write-in candidate, which means they have to go through a process and file paperwork. And that paperwork's not due until August 31st. So we don't even know who the qualified write-in candidates are. So if you're going to write somebody in that's not on the certified write-in list, it's essentially the same as not voting for any candidate, because your vote in that question will not be counted.
Julie, does that include, I'm sorry,
That's okay.
I'm seeing a lot of people saying to write in Newsom as well. Would that count?
No.
No. Okay.
The way that the recall laws are in California is a target of the recall cannot be a candidate to succeed him or herself. So he couldn't even qualify as a write-in candidate. And it will essentially be a no vote on the issue of candidates. And then there's another question about, I've been looking for information on the 46 candidates. So I would suggest that you go to votersedge.org, which is a website that's sponsored by the League of Women Voters. I don't know that all of them have responded, but they do reach out to all the candidates and ask them to submit information about themselves, what their platform is, what their 3 top priorities are. And you can also go there and find out where they're getting their funding, who is giving them funding. And I think on the library's website, I think Sharon, you have a link to that, as well as the League of Voters website. So it's a great resource. Again, only those candidates who have responded, but the last time I looked, which was about a week and a half ago, about half of them had responded. It's free for the candidates to participate, so there's no reason for them not to. But the really important thing too is to see where they're getting their money, and it also says who's supporting them, who's endorsed them. It will have a list of endorsements as well as who's giving them money.
So there was a comment in the chat that somebody went to Voters Edge and needed a login code, and I will say this. the day that Julianne McAdam did her presentation and she discussed votersedge.org, that website was down that day. It just so happened that it was at the same time. So if you went there and got that message, that's not the normal case, and it should be
Right.
restored now.
Yeah, and it does ask you, if you want, you can put in your address and it will give you your exact ballot, but everybody in California is voting on the same ballot. I don't believe that there are any local issues in any county, but if you put in your address, you can also find out where your polling place is and county specific information, but the ballot will essentially be the same for every voter in California.
Okay, any other questions while we have our expert at our disposal?
Except for the John Lewis Act, which just passed yesterday. Doesn't look like it. I appreciate everybody showing up. I see some names that I know, and I see a lot of names that I don't know. So I'm glad that you were all able to participate. And again, a big thank you to Sharon and the library for giving us this opportunity to participate.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. We'll give you 15 minutes of your day back.
Yeah, me too.
And be sure to vote. Okay, take care, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Sharon.
Thank you, Julie.
Did a great job.
Thank you. You did too.
Thanks.
So you're getting lots of thank yous.
Yeah, that's nice.
Okay. All right. I'll share the recording link with everybody. Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Sounds
Bye-bye.
good. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.